My name is Vince Furbo. I am the Vice President for Public Engagement here at the Newberry. And I'd like to start this evening by thanking all of you for joining us for tonight's program, Understanding Race, Past and Present. Whether you are here in the room or joining us from afar via live stream, we are very much grateful for your participation. If you are in the room, I would like to ask you to just take a moment to silence any cell phones or other electronic devices you may have on your person. I see many familiar faces in the room this evening. Welcome back. But I'm going to assume that some of you are new to the Newberry, and I'd like to just take a brief moment to tell you about the library. We have supported and inspired research and learning in the humanities since our founding all the way back in 1887, encouraging users like you to explore their curiosity. Our collection, which spans 600 years of human history, is your collection. Our reading rooms are open to you at no charge Tuesday through Saturday, and our digital resources are freely available to you anytime. We aim to deepen our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us through exhibitions, classes, and programs like tonight's talk. Tonight's program relates to our latest exhibition, Seeing Race Before Race, which is generously supported by the Carl and Marilynn Thoma Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and Pam and Doug Walter. Our galleries will be open tonight until 7:30, so if you have yet to see the show, we invite you to see it after tonight's program. Copies of the exhibition catalog, which is co-edited by one of tonight's speakers, are available in our bookshop. And for those of you who are joining us via live stream, you can also purchase a copy via the website. I also invite you to see Wheels, which is in our smaller exhibition space. It's only open through September 23rd, so now may be your last chance to see it before it rolls out of town. Programs like this one are free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. I invite you to consider making a gift to the Newberry, and you can do so by visiting us online at newberry.org/give. Tonight's program will conclude with a Q&A session. We ask that you text your questions to the number on the screen, 833-899-3399. This is both for those of you joining via live stream and those of you here in the room. The number will be up on the screen throughout the program to help remind you. And now I would like to stop speaking and invite my colleague Leah Markey, Director of the Newberry's Center for Renaissance Studies, to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Vince. It's my honor to introduce our speakers today. Noémie Ndiaye is Associate Professor of English at the University of Chicago. Her first monograph, Scripts of Blackness, Early Modern Performance Culture and the Making of Race, shows how performance culture helped to strategically turn Blackness into a racial category across early modern Western Europe. You can buy that at our bookstore as well. Together, Noémie and I co-edited Seeing Race Before Race, the Visual Culture and the Racial Matrix in the Pre-Modern World, which explores the deployment of racial thinking and racial formations in the visual culture from 1300 to 1800. And Noémie is also co-curator of our current exhibition, Seeing Race Before Race, and we want to thank her for all she's done on this exhibition and beyond. I also want to give a quick shout out to my colleagues in the Center for Renaissance Studies, who were also co-curators, Rebecca Fall, Yasmin Hashimi, Christopher Fletcher, and thank them for their work on the project. And then I will introduce Olivette Otele. She's Distinguished Professor of the Legacies and Memory of Slavery at SOAS, University of London, and a former Vice President of the Royal Historical Society. She's an expert on the history of people of African descent and the links between memory, geopolitics, and legacies of French and British colonialism. Dr. Otele is the first Black woman appointed to a professorial chair in history in the United Kingdom, and her writing has appeared in The Guardian, BBC Extra, and Times Higher Education. She's co-editor of the volume Post-Conflict Memorialization, Missing Memorials, Absent Bodies. And I'd also love to put in a plug for her incredible 2020 book, African Europeans, An Untold History, also for sale in the bookstore. So with that, I will turn over the mic to my colleagues and thank them for being here tonight.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you, Leah, for this lovely introduction. Tonight's conversation will take the form of an interview. I have many questions for Olivette, but I will only get to ask a few of them, and then there will be time for a Q&A session. But so, here we go with my first question. Your magnificent book, African Europeans, An Untold Story, as well as this exhibition, the Newberry's Seeing Race Before Race exhibition, both contribute to the thriving field of pre-modern critical race studies. In the case of your book, more than the pre-modern, because you work from antiquity to the present, but you have some chapters that specifically focus on the pre-modern period. And that field, pre-modern critical race studies, has explored the formation of racial thinking through culture, politics, and social practices prior to the Enlightenment for the last 60 years. For this opening question, I would like for us to discuss a little bit the stakes of that type of work. And in particular, in your book, I was quite struck. It's at the end of the book, one sentence struck me as particularly true and challenging. I'm going to quote it. African European millennials, you wrote, fight against contemporary discrimination without necessarily relating it to the ancestral pain of past victims, unquote. So my question is really, what do you think excavating the really old medieval and early modern past, European past, can do in the fight for justice today? What are the stakes of that type of work today? Especially right now, right? Especially in the current context of pushback against Black studies and critical race theory, both in the US and in the UK.
Wow. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you everyone for being here and for coming on a Tuesday night to attend the talk, and also for the team at the Newberry Library. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Now, your question is interesting. I think the stakes are high. The stakes are about dispelling and challenging assumptions, and those assumptions are about short and longer history, long-term history, long-durée history. It really, I think, is about the assumptions that have led us to this very specific moment where we're focusing on the legacies of the past, but those legacies of the past are really about 17th, 18th, and 19th century past, rather than the legacies of the time that preceded that moment. So the assumptions are, for example, that our formation of identity, the ways in which we relate to each other are based on colonial history. Racism is the result of colonial history. We can assume that, quite rightly so. We can assume that, the challenges that Black studies are facing in the US and the critical race theories are based on what we're seeing today. But what I'm interested in is showing people that race formation started much longer than that. We know that, but race was not necessarily based on the delineations around skin color. And my book is really about showing how we arrive at that point in time in the 18th century where colonial history takes over and eventually shape our identity and our conversation around race. Before that, we had so many other things going on. Race was around religious delineations, around gender identities, around class. Class was a big thing, but also around human geographies. Wherever you lived and belonged determined whether you were racialized or not. And in the book, for example, I talk about the the Irish community. We have a map, I think it's 13th century, the Hereford map, 14th century. The Hereford map is about presenting the world and showing different people in the world as beasts, as foreigners, and and savages, where the Irish were considered to be savages by the English. They're right next door, and yet they consider those people to be savages, not fit to rule, not fit to even live amongst the other English people. So racialization was based not on skin color, not even on religion, but on proximity and on kind of a hierarchization of culture. They were not cultured enough for Albion or for the English. So again, race takes on a different form, and that really is what I was trying to do. So the stakes are high. The stakes are now, the urgency, people dying because of racial discrimination, but also we need to think it through. How did we arrive at that point in time, and what we need to do to actually, dispel those assumptions? That's a long answer.
That's great.
I'll try to be short.
And I love your emphasis on the facets, the several facets of the concept of race and practices of race making in pre-modernity. As you said, class was a major one, religion as well, and we tried to emphasize that in the exhibition. So if you haven't seen it yet, you will find out when you go see the exhibition that in the first of the two rooms, which is really an introduction to the racial matrix in early modernity, we have all those labels that let you explore what it means to think of language as a racializing trope, to think about class and gender along those lines. And you will also notice on the entrance doors, you will see two characters that are taken from Nicolas de Nicolet's travel book that recounts his travels to the Ottoman Empire. And the two images we used are an image on the right side, you will see a black man, and on the left side, you will see a Jewish woman. So we were really trying to mobilize all those paradigms.
That is interesting because I don't want to digress, but it's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize as well in the book is the fact that I mentioned that some of you might be aware of this. So we are 1255, 13th century, and we have the remembrancer, and you have which king was it again? Henry III, and Henry III got 91 Jewish people arrested because they were suspected of having killed a child, and one of them was executed, and he forced them, on the remembrancer, which is an official document, he's forcing them to wear a badge. And that really is important for me to mention, that the invention and the creation of race, because he's forcing them to wear a badge, and we are 7 centuries before Hitler. So again, it's important to understand how race and racialization plays out.
Absolutely. Thank you. I wanted to ask a question that is based upon your book, right? Based upon the history of African Europeans. And perhaps that question actually relates more generally to patterns of racialization. We'll see. But I wanted to ask about the specificity of the pre-modern period in this history of Black Europeans that you narrated for us. I wanted to ask what, according to you, what is particularly interesting about the pre-modern, so the medieval and early modern chapters of that history? What stands out?
For me, what really stands out is the racialization, as I said, is based on class, race, and at times gender, on human geographies. But it's also based on color. So we are not completely outside the color lines, but we're using them at times, and they are framed in different ways. Just to give you an example, we are, I think, 15th century Granada. We have somebody called Juan Latino, and Juan Latino is of African descent. He's a black man, as we would say today, and he is somebody who's extraordinary because he's a scholar. And he's managing to, and he's got the support of the king, so, kind of protected in a way, but he's going to tell the king about what it would mean to actually stop hatred and racial hatred along racial lines. So you have the Muslims fighting against the Christians, you have the Moriscos who were the converted Muslims, you have the Jewish, and all that is such a mess that is creating a kingdom that is kind of crumbling in a way. And Juan Latino, this black man, is going to find a way through his writing to explain all these things to the king and to tell him that, you know what, you're actually creating a situation where you're going to destroy the kingdom, but also destroy the rest of Europe if you don't tackle it. I mean, they don't necessarily listen to him completely, but he's telling them, and this, I could relate to those stories because this is a time where all is coming together, and some of them are listening to this person. They're seeing this black man as, because he's educated, they can listen to him. So there's a kind of class base that is also there at play, that is making them kind of forget about his color. So the subtleties of education, really.
I remember in the book you mentioned the play that was written about Juan Latino's life. I love teaching that play. It's so heartbreaking. And I'm thinking about this scene in particular, since you're mentioning class and exceptionalism. The scene in particular where he is asking the Duke of Sessa, who is his enslaver, for his freedom, right? And every time he asks, the Duke finds a way to deflate, not to answer the request, by praising him, praising his education. You are amazing, you are this rare bird, you are this genius, but can I be free? Am I free? You are so precious, you are this, you are that, and this goes on. You find this pattern repeated 5 times, absolutely heartbreaking. And what is powerful in the scene is that it shows you that it's precisely because this man is so educated, right? It's such a rare black man, that he cannot be freed.
Yes.
So those things, it can cut both ways.
Yes. To bring it back to our contemporary societies, there's also the danger of exceptionalism, where you put somebody on the pedestal and then they're the only one who's allowed to be on that pedestal, particularly black and brown bodies. You mentioned when you were introducing me, the first black woman to be a history professor in the UK. That was in 2018, so that wasn't too long ago. Well, that comes with certain things about exceptionalism. It shuts the door, actually, for others, because, there can only be one, and therefore she's so good that, you're different from the rest of your community. So it has multiple layers of discrimination, to just look at that way.
And we don't need more than one, right? just publicize, just use her image as much as possible.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for this. Okay, I see that we are, time is flying by, so we need to get moving, but there's so much to discuss. I loved in the book the phrase that you quoted from scholars Naïl Verndoy and Grégoire Fauconnier. Here's a quotation that the overwhelming number of paintings with black subjects posited the continent of Europe as an imaginary black museum. Just love thinking of it that way. So most exhibitions that focus on black figuration usually start in the 18th century, for the reasons that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. And that is not the case for this exhibition, right? We deliberately wanted to start in the 13th century. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this exhibition that you saw earlier today. Were there anything, captured your attention?
Yes, I loved it. This is fantastic, and I'm smiling because it's not because they invited me, by the way. I have to say that. I work really, in the last few years, I've worked with museums, and in particular, the British Museum and the V&A, because I worked at their Board of Research Committee, and I'm still working with them. And what is interesting is that here you're able to do what they think they can't do, which is really about simplifying certain things, but actually putting in so much content that you challenge people. For example, there's an interactive way without technology that you can do museum, ask people questions rather than just shoving information in their faces in a way. Okay, I'm not criticizing my colleagues from the British Museum. I'm just saying that this is quite specific and quite unique in the sense that I haven't seen it before, where you're having a dialogue with the audience with your questions and you're challenging their assumptions in a way that is still careful and thoughtful, and I think it's really good. And because it's a delicate question, it's race, it's really difficult to kind of do that. So most museums would rather not talk about, not take any risk and not talk about it. So there are things there. If I was to have like a top three, I have something about the Black Madonnas, okay? I mean, I talk about them in my book, but I have a particular, I don't know why, affinity to maybe Christian remnants, I don't know, affinity about Black Madonnas because it's about gender, it's about race, it's also about religion, so all the kind of racial dynamics that you can find, but it's also about the fact that the way you present the Black Madonna there, and you put her in a context where that Black Madonna specifically was presented to I think it was Peru, presented to the colonizers, the enslaved, the indigenous population, and you're asking the audience to actually think it through and think about how these populations might have perceived the Black Madonna. So they can relate. I related to that because I wanted to try and find out a bit more about the colonizers, and it means that you can transport that idea to the common place because we're all living kind of together, separate but equal, I don't know, but we're living, coming from different backgrounds, but living together, and we need to find a way to relate at some point, and those Black Madonnas are relatable in a way. So that's my first one. The second one is a map. And we talked about that earlier on. It's a map of Africa. I was born in Cameroon, and I looked at the specific place where Cameroon is presented, and it's really interesting because it's 1695. The date of the map dates to 1695, and what is interesting about it is they talk about kingdoms. Not once do they say tribes. And for me, it makes sense. 1695, they were already talking about kingdom. Transport to 21st century, when we refer to Africa, we talk about tribes. And for me, that is fascinating. I need to use that with my student to actually see how there's a kind of devaluation of African history. And that was number two. So number three was the short clips that you will see by Keith Hamilton, because it was fascinating. He's talking about Shakespeare, and he's talking about him as a Black man not being seen, but also hypervisibility, but not being seen, generally speaking, or considered. And then the second level of his talk is about Shakespeare being seen as the height of education. It's about cultural literacy. If you can read Shakespeare, people think you're clever, right? And yet him being able to relate to Shakespeare completely floors people because they don't understand how is that possible. And I think that was interesting because, again, we go back to the exceptionalism, the cultural literacy, how you're not expected as a Black person to relate to certain things, and in my case, for example, to classical music and things like that, because it's not supposed to be your culture. And yet you do, and people are just, they're losing their marbles.
Keith Hamilton Cobb, the actor, playwright, and not director, Kim Wilde is the director, but Keith Hamilton Cobb is actually at the moment involved in a project titled Untitled Othello Project. He wants to direct it himself. That's the next step in his, Othello project. I love the Black Madonna too. In part because it's she's so problematic.
Yeah.
She's gorgeous and problematic, and that's a good definition for the kind of objects we were looking to include in this exhibition. In part because, again, if you haven't seen her yet, this is a Black Madonna with baby Jesus coming out of her shoulder in weird but still beautiful ways. And this is a painting that represents a devotional statue, right? That comes from Italy, Our Lady of Loreto. So this is a European Black Madonna that was painted in order to be transported to Peru and to become the object of devotional practices in Peru, presumably, as you were saying earlier, with Afro-diasporic and indigenous people approaching and watching this painting. So the reason why I'm saying that she's problematic is because, on the one hand, she is so powerful, right? If you think about the Christian order of the world, the Madonna is the single most powerful woman there is, right? So putting a Black woman in that position is very satisfying from a modern perspective. And at the same time, this is so reminiscent of forced conversion. That was the first step for enslavement, right? That comes to mind when you think of the Peruvian context. So she's right there at this intersection of empowerment and enslavement in ways that cannot fully be reconciled, and we're just, sitting with this tension in the exhibition.
But that speaks to Black liberation as well. It's a kind of reappropriating and being able to fight within the context, even if it's an oppressive context, to still find a way to appropriate that setting and to turn it into what you wanted to turn it into. But anyway, that's a different conversation, isn't it?
Yes, we need to keep moving, but hopefully we'll be able to come back to the fair map at some point. Actually, a follow-up on that previous question, still about your impressions about the exhibition. When I was reading your book, African Europeans, I was very interested in the moments when you are drawing attention to historical connections between African Europeans and other people of color, right? North Africans, Jews, South Asians. And I was also moved by the Afro-feminist dimension of your historiographic method and choices. So keeping those two things in mind, the question of Black and brown relations and intersectional feminist orientation. Did you see those two themes playing out somehow in the exhibition, or maybe some artworks in particular or books particularly spoke to those two issues?
Yes, because you talk about the Ottoman Empire several times. Turkey is mentioned there, and the racialization and the kind of which lines. It's a bit, we always see it that way, as in Black and brown people being racialized, but how about the others racializing people of European descent or white people? So you do that in the exhibition. And in terms of the women, I mentioned the Black Madonna, but there's this thing, I so happen to also be French, so I couldn't help but be stopped by the painting with Madame du Barry, who was the mistress of King, which one was it again? Charles, Louis the 13th, 13. And the fact that in that painting you have a Black boy who's there, it was quite common to have that, the contrast, a Black boy, a Black page, and a servant. And what is interesting for me, and I didn't know, is they call him Zamor, the African, but he was actually Bengali, and I've never known that. And yet they insisted, and my guess is she probably knew. It didn't matter. You're extra-European, so therefore you must be African. And I think in terms of racialization, that also is interesting. And she's a woman who is in a sphere where she's the king's mistress, so she's not necessarily in a comfortable position. Her position is fragile, so there's no commonality of suffering or precarity or anything. She has dominion and power over this guy. And I thought that's quite interesting. So she's not the female liberator then, she's the oppressor, while she's being oppressed at the time. In fact, I think, was she executed? Yeah, and she ended up dead. I mean, what kind of tragic destiny.
He accused her of treason. Zamor.
Yeah. Yes. So he's the one instigating the killing of the woman. It's tragic. Again, it makes me think about the commonality. How is it that we, the oppressed, wherever they are, gender, race, or whatever they are, how is it that we can't manage to find these points of connections to precisely fight for equality? Or maybe we can, and we have seen that in history. So this is what I'm interested in.
I'm not sure I fully caught your first point about Black and brown connections.
The Black and brown connections was the Ottoman Empire that did not see itself as brown,
I see.
but that we see as brown today, don't we? The Asian, the Mughal empire that did not see itself again as particularly racialized and being second to, in that hierarchy of Blumenbach, kind of 19th century racism, so-called scientific racism, but they're looking outwards and they're racializing Europeans, and that was interesting for me to see, really.
Just to give, for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition yet, just to give you a little bit of background to understand Olivette's point, a couple of items in the exhibition that are relevant. The Tari manuscript, which is this 16th century Ottoman manuscript, open in the exhibition at the page where you see Potosi, right? That represents those mines, and you find a figuration of a black man, possibly enslaved, and a white man, and the difference between the two in this American context. Interestingly, this Ottoman manuscript was working off European sources, Italian and Spanish. So you find this transnational movement and end up wondering what the blackness of the worker might have meant to an Ottoman reader.
Yes.
And the other item that I think you were alluding to was the Mughal,
Yes.
right, a beautiful miniature alone from the Art Institute that represents a feast at the Mughal court where you find Europeans involved, and it's apparently based off representations of the wedding at Cana, which was, a template, really, in Renaissance European iconography. And what's one of the things that's particularly interesting about it is that in the European, especially the Italian representations of that scene by Veronese, for instance, you find a lot of black servants that are inserted there. So you see the work of racialization, and that's not the case at all in this Mughal representation. It's white people who are exoticized.
Yeah, very interesting.
Those are part of my top three.
Okay.
To get back to your point about Madame du Barry, we have a cluster actually focusing on white womanhood and the relation between white women and black props, whether we think of Zamore as a prop, or whether we think of the beauty spots, right, the fake beauty spot. I'm looking at you, Becky, because Becky wrote about those. She really conceived of that cluster. The beauty spots that white women were using at the time, and that women haters and racists were basically reading as dangerous, because when white women put on those cosmetic devices on their faces, somehow they were becoming black in a way. So yes, thinking about white womanhood is also a very strong feature of this exhibition.
Absolutely, yeah.
The De Fair map, I keep thinking, I think it's a little bit like the Loreto, to the extent that we're interested in those tensions, right, internal to the object. This map of Africa that you were mentioning earlier, it is indeed so interesting and wonderful that they're using the term royaume, right, kingdom. And then at the same time, the way there's a lot of text on those maps. You you will see when you approach them, there's way too much text to really take it in. But if you have the patience and try to read it, you will see that what they say is the opposite of empowering, right, about African people. So the ability to hold those two notions at the same time, to me, that's one of the things that's really interesting about early modernity. Those contradictions, right, that people live with, that determine the way in which they think about blackness, but also about racial difference more generally, right? And the ways, the contortions, the stories that Europeans tell themselves in order to work around those contradictions.
It's the construction of inferiority as well. It's a hierarchization, but it's how do you put yourself at the top if there's no somebody who is supposed to be inferior? So for those of you who might have seen about African history, you have these contradictions where the first Europeans arriving there, they indeed met kingdoms. They had to negotiate. They were the beggars, so to speak. Things changed dramatically over the next centuries, but they had to. So the map is representing those kingdoms, but at the same time, the consideration that they had for these people was not much, really. I'm kind of not urging you. Do you remember that documentary that we did? That what is it called? Oh, I should know. Netflix, forgive me. African Queens.
Sorry.
African Queens. Not the Cleopatra one, because it kind of it rubbed people the wrong way. But the first one about Queen Njenga. Some of you, it's on Netflix. It's called African Queens, and you kind of see, in a way, a little bit the hierarchization in terms of Europeans, the way they look at Africans, the way they try to negotiate. They despise them because of the power dynamic, but at the same time, they have to negotiate with them, the Kingdom of Congo and all that. So the map for me was really, it brought that to mind, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Netflix.
Actually, I believe that Cécile Froment was consulted, involved in that specific
Yeah, sorry.
segment of the documentary, and she is a contributor to this catalog. So
Yes. Why am I thinking
we were
that
very
you-
lucky.
Yes.
Thinking about, following this thread, and really, I just want to talk about the objects in this exhibition. Do you remember the atlas that focuses on China?
Oh, yes.
Right. It's a 1663, I believe, mid 1660s atlas, the Blau, that represents Beijing, and a little bit along the same lines of what you're describing, even though it's earlier, map, atlas, and created in the Dutch context, not at all in the French, Franco-African context. You can see on the top of this representation of Beijing, two Chinese characters that are holding a compass and other instruments necessary to create geographical knowledge, right? So they're holding up those Chinese epistemological tools, which is a form of, it's like calling this organization a kingdom, right? And then at the bottom, you have a representation of other Chinese characters that are animalized, right? Where the nails are turning into animal claws, right? So the same tensions between respect, admiration, envy, right?
Ambiguity, yes.
And just, denigration
Yes.
is there too.
You have to see the exhibition, basically. I think you'll enjoy it.
And yes, we talked about a little bit about American More, which was your number 3 in the top 3. And I would love to just hear more about it. I'm a Shakespeare nerd, so I would love to hear more about what you thought of this.
What I thought about what Shakespeare, oh.
No, about Shakespeare, if you will, but American More.
I think that it seems like a big, like a mouthful term when you say democratization of knowledge, but that really is it. It's about art belonging to everybody. It's about being accessible to everybody, and it's about the reception that you have when you're trying to see and to say what it means for you to connect with those so-called canons. And I'm speaking as a kind of as a Black woman, as a French Black woman who grew in a French environment, where when you start talking about classical music, for example, and you mention a few classical composers, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, 18th century Black man, people get really offended about that, offended that you're mentioning it, but also offended that he actually existed and they didn't know about that. So there's this thing about, cultural literacy that becomes a class thing when it shouldn't. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that I made connections with my own history with that exhibition. Okay, I'm going to bring it. Marcel Proust talked about the Madeleine. You have that cake, and every time he ate that cake, it reminded him of his grandmother. Well, I had the Madeleine moments there, where I see something and it reminds me of my childhood and my upbringing and me evolving in circles that are not supposed to be mine. And me living in the UK, where I'm not supposed to know much about Shakespeare, we still happen to be, to know as well about Shakespeare in France. And they're like, well, it doesn't belong to you. What would you know about Shakespeare? Anyway, so I guess an exhibition like that is not just about bringing in knowledge and sharing knowledge and provoking, but also the relationship that the audience has with the object and each story. Again, it brings me to the fact that I don't want to sound kumbaya, but this is who I am. I teach colonial history. I look at trauma, pain, and violence all the time. But I also think that we wouldn't be sitting here, all of us, any of us, together if there was no collaborations at all. You know, if at some point some people didn't come together to make this happen. So we also need to teach about those things. And I guess in the exhibition, I saw glimpses of that. Yeah.
That is so nicely put. I have a last question, and then I guess I'll have to cede the floor for the Q&A session. But really, I'm curious to hear, what your hopes are for the future of this field that we work in.
Well, I'm very hopeful. I'm a half-full person, so I think what's happening is really changing people's perception of the past. We say all the time, oh, you don't really learn from the past. We do all the time. We are able to rewrite narratives of the past right now. It has been happening. It happens all the time. So education is key. That's why I'm a teacher. Education is about challenging assumptions, challenging the big narratives. I also hear all the time, oh, but you can't rewrite history. This is what historians do. We rewrite history all the time. Why can't we rewrite our own history right now and make it our own, not just the story of, perception or persecutions of the past, but understand that those persecutions are still existing now. So what is it that we're doing to make things better? We are the custodians of this planet, and we only have that short amount of time in here. So what is it that we're going to do to make it better? I don't know. I want to be able to think that I've done something a tiny bit better for somebody. I don't know. It feels good, doesn't it? I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we start taking questions?
Here is one to start with. Kind of bringing together a lot of the conversation that you've been having. A question: how did colonialism transform the multiple pre-modern forms of race, as represented by Shakespeare and others, into one that we now think of as being dominated by color? So how did all of those things with class and language and human geography coalesce into something that now is dominated by color or complexion?
You're the pre-modern one. I'm an 18th century. Go on.
You're the historian.
Yeah. Okay. My answer would be economic wealth had its downside. The richer people got, the more interested they were in kind of explaining how that is made possible. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. 18th century plantation owner called John Penny in Bristol saying, I'm disgusted at the scenes of trauma, at the flesh exposed, but these people, if they're here, it's because God probably made them so that they can serve me and make me wealthy. This is John Penny. So I guess the richer they got, the more justification they found to explain why is it that they needed to do that and why it had to be specifically people of African descent, because it was an easy access, so-called easy access, and therefore all the narrative about our identity, our history, was constructed around 18th century wealth-building industry, around the hierarchy. So pre-modern had more in terms of the hierarchies I told you about. They narrowed it down to skin color that we inherited. And I think it's really the justification based on wealth. They had to find an explanation for that, I think.
Thank you for that. Another question, I think this actually plays well into the first one. Could you talk a bit about the evolution of the term race? When did it emerge in its modern sense? And what does it mean to study race before the emergence of that concept as we now think of it? We do say in the exhibition that race existed before there was a term for it. So how did we get here with that concept?
What are you looking
I have a feeling that this question is for me. Or I'm happy to,
Good.
start a response. So we start really finding the term race in various European languages in the 15th century, end of the 14th century and 15th century. And really it has to do, at the time, it has to do with this notion of lineage, right? It's where you come from, and who you are descended from, what you carry in your blood with you. And so primarily in that context of 15th and early 16th century, you find it to refer to the question of class. Do you have blue blood or do you not have blue blood? Class is the primary paradigm, and we see it applied as well progressively to folks of non-Christian religious background. And the question was, when does it become? So what happens in the 16th century as the slave trade develops in the Atlantic world, is that this term becomes also used to refer to what we see as phenotypical difference, for which skin color becomes a shorthand, right? So 16th century is really when this is happening. And little by little, the mechanisms that Olivette was just describing a minute ago mean that the term became increasingly used, specialized in that last silo, if you will. Did I miss parts of the question? Okay. Olivette.
No, it's good. It's good. I'm not going to trouble the waters. It's brilliant.
Well, I'll just be quiet.
Beautiful. If we have a question that's sort of looking even farther back, thinking about that hierarchization that you've been discussing, that says that, there were Black Africans who visited Europe in the medieval period. You've written in your book about Black African Europeans in classical antiquity. So this question is saying, in those early periods, were Africans, how were they sort of hierarchized? Did Europeans see them as simply different, or was there already a sense of an attempt at creating this kind of structure of power and hierarchy? So really, when did we get to this this sort of, the kind of violence that we understand today? And was there a time when that didn't exist, I guess?
I often take the example of Septimius Severus, African, North African. He becomes the, what's the term again? I'm trying to find the name. He's the Caesar of his time, He's the one who's going to lead the campaign of Britannia and conquered Great Britain. He dies in York. So he's African, he's Roman, because by that time the Roman Empire had conquered North Africa, Egypt, etc. And he does claim his Africanity. We have, in the British Museum, we have an image of him. His brown skin, his wife is lighter skin. And the hierarchy is not based on his skin color. It's not necessarily based on where he was born, because Leptis Magna, which is nowadays Libya, was part of the empire. So as early as that, I don't see it, the Roman Empire, as some of you might know, was, in today's term, very multicultural. It was about being part of the empire rather than being black or this and that. So little by little, things changed, and again, completely cemented in the 18th century. Yeah.
If I can add something quickly, I would say that, there are way, various ways of valuing black identity, right? And so if we're looking at those really early period, the Middle Ages, then you do, and antiquity as well, you do find sometimes positive representations of African people, and you find some very negative ones, right? We were having this conversation earlier with Chris Fletcher over there, who is medievalist and part of the curating team, and Chris was telling me about this 11th century Italian document, so prior to the Crusades, right, that tells the story of someone who has a dream, and in that dream, demons appear in the form of Ethiopians, right? So you find some negative representations. There are some positive representations. What matters really is which ones are going to be mobilized on a strategic basis, right? It's when there is a competition for resources. It's when there is a need to create a hierarchy, again, in order to distribute rights, privileges, and resources, because resources are limited, that the negative representations are chosen. It's always strategic.
Beautiful, thank you.
Can I just add something? We are Alexandre de Medici. He's of dual heritage or mixed race, if you want to use this term. He's the first Duke of Florence, one of the most powerful men at the time. He's in his early 20s. And they dislike him not because he's of dual heritage or his mother was black. They dislike him because he's accused of being a sexual predator. So again, the color doesn't come, it's class and gender in that case.
Quick shout out for a public program that we have coming up later this fall, a screening of a short film about, there's a very character called, the film is Il Moro, with Daphne Jacinto, the filmmaker. So there will be a screening and Q&A about it. We have a couple of questions that have been coming up about teaching, and teaching these difficult histories. In the classroom, the idea of how to structure looking at these objects that can be very difficult, or here's one I'll read that has come up. How do you help your students discuss these traumatic moments and violence in our colonial past that may still resonate as being very real for them today? So that's a big question.
It is a hard question. It's not so much for me about plunging immediately into the trauma and the difficult. And I was mentioning earlier, for example, if I'm going to talk about 18th century enslavement, plantation life, I can't just start talking about it because we are 21st century people where people of African descent have already been devalued. They're supposed to be at the bottom of the social ladder. Where, there's already been the 19th century so-called scientific racism. So we start with that in mind already in our psyche. So what I want to give students when we're talking about kind of empire, colonization, I'll start with the Library of Timbuktu. And they're like, what? That's not part of the creed. Yeah, it is. It's about telling you that there were civilizations that preceded this one. And then in the long history of humanity, this is a time, this is a period that might take us to the end of the planet. I hope not, but there were several civilizations, and we are living that one now. But before that, there were a library in Timbuktu that was kind of the birthplace of knowledge and first library in the world, so to speak. And then I helped them understand how we move from there to here to now, and how in the process of moving to where we are now, it took pain, it took trauma, and it led to the enslavement of people to create wealth. And therefore, they need to understand what enslavement means, and therefore we go into the deeper traumatic. But I can't just plunge them into like that. I don't know. Seems to work.
Thank you. I will give you our last question. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of these, but we have a couple of questions that have come up about popular representations of the past, either imagined, and there's a question about Queen Charlotte, the Bridgerton show, that imagines a different world that comes because of a black queen in England, as well as someone who knows that you work historical consultant on the film Chevalier. You discussed that composer earlier in the conversation. So could you just tell us, to conclude, a little bit about how these popular representations that take up race in the pre-modern period could potentially help us make sense of our world today?
Well, I'm really torn about this. If I just, go back to Bridgerton very quickly, I had such a hard time with the first one, because that sugar is overflowing, and sugar, for me, I teach the history of sugar and the pain it brought. I just couldn't bear it. It was so hard. So hard that I ended up having a talk at the British Museum about how terrible that was. And then something happened. That something is me being invited in LA and being in that hotel where they have the Queen's Ball. And the Queen's Ball was a mile long of people dressed up going to the Queen's Ball. And a huge majority of these people were African Americans. I'm like, what? You like Bridgerton? And they did. And they were happy. And they were beaming. And I started talking to people. I don't know how many of them I talked to. So it was about something I missed as a historian. It was about human connection and how being included in a history that generally removed them from history. It's as simple as that. And that made them feel included in a kind of protective elite history. And how actually it brought people together in that room where you had people from various backgrounds. So there is something about me, historian, going, no, this is not accurate. And then me being a human saying, this is a fantastic opportunity for human connection. And as for Chevalier, sorry, Stephen, love you in all, that's the director. But I saw the result at the end, and they focused mostly on the love story. Whereas for me, it was about the man fighting the French Revolution and, setting up a whole kind of regiment of black and brown people to fight. And it didn't appear. But that's okay. I can say I worked on helping bring that, at least contributing to that story, Yeah.
Beautiful, thank you.